Hi, you're listening to the We Make Media podcast. I'm your host, Karen Derricates. Hi, I'm here with pioneering technology researcher Carl Miller, the co-founder and research director of the Center for Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world. He combines data and analysis with immersive first-hand reporting. His first book, The Death of the Gods, The New Global Power Grab, was published in 2018 by Penguin Random House. He has written for Wired, New Scientist, The Sunday Times, The Telegraph, and The Guardian, appears frequently in the press, and speaks about his work around the world. I've asked him to talk with me today about synthetic media, aka deep fakes, and the increasing role they are playing in changing democracy and disrupting power systems for good and bad. Hi, Carl. How are you doing?
Hi there, Karen. Very good, thanks.
So let's start with what exactly synthetic media are and how they're being used. To those already at the table, this discussion is kind of well on its way. But I think most folks, despite the growing ubiquity of synthetic media, other than the growing concerns around deep fakes, which is just one aspect of synthetic media environments, the majority of folks remain unaware of its wide-reaching effects on our present and future landscape and creative industries. So can you explain for folks a bit about the role of machine learning and the genesis of generative adversarial networks, or GANs, and what it all has to do with synthetic media?
Sure. Synthetic media, the term actually, for me, brings forth all these really fond memories of being in Canada. So it was shortly after my book was published, I actually did a little tour around Canada in Halifax and Toronto and over to the other coast as well. Kind of doing a series of talks on synthetic media. Back in the day when we could still get on planes and still actually travel across borders. So it kind of reminds me of a kind of very, very fun time I had, even if the subject matter was a little bit dark. I think there's probably two kind of faces to this coin, synthetic media, that we need to talk about. The first is technical, and you've already thrown us into that with generative adversarial networks, but it's really kind of a bundle of different machine learning approaches that I would say all have one key kind of implication, which is that they are allowing machines to learn more and more about what being or sounding like a human being is really like. The kind of oldest version of this might well be the Turing test, actually put forward by Alan Turing himself, which basically said that the Turing test would be complete when a machine could engage in a conversation with a human being such that the human being would not know that it was a machine talking. And we've got lots of different versions of the Turing test now. Probably the time when generative adversarial networks leapt into people's consciousness for the first time, if they ever have, was when a series of websites sprung up, all using them in order to basically generate faces of people which, despite looking absolutely, totally convincing, never existed. And then they did it for cats, and then they did it for bunny rabbits, and they did lots of other things.
Yeah, and I'll include those in the show notes. Those are really, this cat does not exist and this person does not exist.com. They are the uncanny. Yeah, it's really
it's totally uncanny, and you know, and there was you know, and there's a whole kind of text based version of that, which is the same. You know, it's gobbling up all your tweets and then sounding very, very similar to you. That's the technical side of it. Then there's obviously a kind of political or even geopolitical side of it, and that actually was the main topic of conversation when I went across Canada, which was, well, how is this actually being applied? And the kind of fear then, and I think the fear even more now, is that what we will see is the application of these technologies, which themselves are very naive and innocent. You know, a generative adversarial network doesn't know why it's being told to do something, but we'll see them being deployed for basically political effect. And I think chiefly amongst them is to try and create a kind of series of reactions, either emotional or kind of political, from a kind of watching public in order to get them to do something. So that might be rumor bombing, where you create a series of kind of fake videos showing a purported chemical weapons leak in a city, causing everyone to panic and rush into cars and clog the roads, whereas in fact no such leak has happened. Or with deepfakes, the big fear is that, a speech from a world leader will be created using them in order to, cause a country to react in a way that the person wants. So that's the kind of combination of these things. And they kind of, I guess, fit into already standing fears that we've got about a world in the digital age hurtling beyond truths, or into a world of fake news and disinformation and influence operations. And then kind of synthetic media is slightly further down the line. I always see it on the horizon as being a kind of a whole new layer of technologies coming online, which will just make all those things even more convincing.
There's so many amazing, interesting things you can do with it. Like, it's very exciting to me. I'm a collage and digital artist, and I everything I do is made from something, not from nothing. And in terms of licensing that I can't afford or whatever for a little audio clip or for this and that, it's very, very interesting for listeners to put it into context, because I know these are very complicated things, and because they reach society, politics, they'll, from a creative perspective, right, they're almost these a way of wrapping one media artifact around another, right? And for me, what's exciting about that is that you could take an image of a painting of a cat and wrap it around footage of a lion and make this this painting of this cat kind of roar or kind of or physically make digital 3D assets move by attaching by 3D scan or sensor based knowledge of mapping or whatever. So they can be used in kind of XR experiences as almost a human mouse or stylus. And also, as we know from face swap, they can be used to kind of swap one aspect of two different pieces of media, and they're content generated from the zillion points of data that we've been feeding to the network for 50 some years. But of course, as you referred to, the most nefarious, the biggest fear is the use by nefarious forces and bad actors that could kind of potentially, put the final nail in the coffin of any concept of truth or fact or shared reality. Is that about right? I mean, tell us the doomsday report from the future. Like, what are the sort of worst we've seen so far? And where are deep fakes? What are the very valid concerns of where we're going to be soon with the deep fakes? And then we'll try to be positive. We'll try to find something.
Well, there's actually this kind of fascinating link between kind of online artistic installations that often deploy these technologies in a surrealist or a wistful or outrightly poetic and beautiful way, and then unfortunately a kind of weaponization that happens. It was exactly the same with bots on Twitter. Now quite an outmoded weapon in the information war, but I remember probably back in 2014, 2015 becoming really interested in automated accounts. And back then it was this strange niche thing that these digital installation artists were doing, where they would kind of set up a Twitter account and it would be linked to, a pressure panel in a road and would tweet to complain about potholes, or it would gobble up 3 different poems and combine them together in a really interesting way, or give you a really surreal response to a question that you asked. And they kind of just, they weren't actually even against Twitter's rules. Twitter quite liked having those things on there because it was a kind of new, interesting use of the platform. And I remember building my own, trying to tell people to not be Nazis online, or to call each other Nazis online as well, because I thought Reductio ad Hitlerum, my book was called. And then and then a couple of years later, it was already clear actually at that point that they would have political uses as well. The fact that they were tireless, the fact that they could act in incredible volumes, and the fact that one person could set up just an arbitrary number of these things to kind of emulate a crowd. All of them clearly had, I thought at that point kind of campaign rather than kind of warfare uses, to be honest. But I thought these things will certainly be picked up by political campaigns around the world. And then a couple of years later, 2016, Russia and the election of Donald Trump, there is this huge kind of global attention on bots, basically as a a kind of minion of Russia. And you know, the fact that they'd been used to create these fake crowds online, the fact that there were potentially tens of thousands of them, that they probably were awash all the other different platforms as well. You know, they'd been moved from being this kind of wishful, playful, artistic plaything into a strange new kind of geopolitical confrontation. And Karen, the key idea here, really, and I'll give you the doomsday scenario not as a picture, but as an idea, which I sadly think is going to come to increasingly dominate a lot of the conflicts which human beings have, is information warfare. Now, if you look back to about that time, about 2013, 2014, militaries around the world were all basically reconceiving of what warfare really was. They were all asking themselves the same question, which was, we now live in the information age. What in the information age is the role of militaries? You know, really deep questions to do with why they existed. And they all basically had the same answer. And it didn't matter whether you were a liberal democratic military or an autocratic one, whether you were Canada, the UK, Russia, NATO, whoever. Basically, everyone, like a stack of dominoes, all reconceived warfare in a really, really, really important way. They all had previously seen information as a tool of war, for sure. It's been used like that in that way for thousands of years. You've written the fake letter to get the army to try and leave the castle that you're besieging. That stuff has always been the case. But all of them did this like crucial conceptual pivot. They all saw information not as being a tool of war, but being a space that war happened within. That was the crucial thing. So they saw it as a theatre of war. So air, sea, land, space, and now information. So, you know, suddenly you had all this language about information maneuver, information dominance, mimetic weaponry, full spectrum operations, behavioural-centric warfare. You know, basically they said warfare's ultimate aim is to get people to either act or not act in a certain way, like through a panoply of different mechanisms, including force. Information is one of the ways in which that conflict will be fought. So that's a doomsday scenario, is that what we're seeing now is that idea kind of taking through and running and speeding up and basically becoming the principal domain of human conflict. And all of our wistful, wonderful Twitter bots and other forms of digital art and the tools like generative adversarial networks and the way they're being deployed are all going to become wrapped up in an informational conflict, which many more people than states will be fighting within. You know, I mean, what we're seeing in the States at the moment, what we saw throughout the entire campaign was the alt-right and other extremists deploying very deliberately informational warfare doctrines to try and have effects.
What's scary too is that I don't know how the systems that we've built, I saw the video of you speaking with the police board, or they must have thought you were an alien. I mean, other than like the small group like working in cyber. I'm sure a lot of people were like, I didn't sign up for this. Is not the profession. When I wanted to grow up and be a police officer, it's not like, understanding these environments. It's like, going and ticketing people and, being a part of the community. And I'm sure there's plenty of cutting edge, individuals in the field, but it seems we've got a lot of catching up.
A lot of my job over the last kind of 4 or 5 years has been basically this kind of tour of lots of institutions, telling them how the rug is being pulled out from under their feet, and that they're far less powerful than they thought they were, and unless kind of fundamental reform happens, we're hurtling into a world of calamity. Sometimes that's listened to in some way, like part-time. Sometimes it isn't. I mean, with the police, the message that I've been trying to get into police forces around the world for ages is that we are living through the worst crisis of law enforcement in the history of modern policing, because half of crime now happens on the internet. And the way the police are set up is the opposite of the way they need to be set up to police the internet. In the UK, it's called Peel. The Peelium system of policing is a very enlightened idea. It's the absolute core of how modern policing works, which is that the police come out of the community, they police their own community, and they police with the consent of that community. The consensus-based policing in the UK, that's why we don't have military helmets here. That's why the police aren't armed. It's why they walk around in their community, why we have such an emphasis on local policing. And, for the internet, that none of that works anymore at all. Like, what's the community that you're policing online? What's the consent that the online community has given to you? I mean, and local police forces are the opposite way of dealing with a fundamentally like a geographic thing such as the internet. Likewise, the military, really. So if you go to a liberal democratic military, either in the UK or Canada, and say the domain of war that's now got the most energy and changing the quickest is information, a lot of them have been brought up on this, like, a very important fundamental idea that it is not the role of a liberal democratic military to muck around in a free press. Like, you just don't do it. I mean, you don't intervene informationally. That's not the role. That's what the autocrats do. That's what the communists did. That's not what we do in the West. And it's a very difficult conversation to have, because you end up basically saying things like, I think militaries should write a rules of engagement for informational conflict.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
It's a slippery slope. It's an extremely slippery slope. And unless it's done in the right way, it will lead us to emulating oppressive and autocratic regimes around the world in ways we don't want to.
Yeah, and they're valid critiques or pushback, but at the same time, like, we know with the speed of which that everything's, it's like once information has been weaponized, to ignore it, it's just ignore the terrorist, like, in the waiting room or whatever. It's like, it's not gonna. But let's talk about some other facets of synthetic media, other than, we kind of talked about the technology and the way that it's, creating, like, it's machines creating content. But also there's so many other aspects that you talk about in terms of the synthetic, that contribute to the synthetic media landscape, and kind of like creating a synthetic virility. Like, one of the things but now I feel like after reading your stuff, like, maybe I'm wrong, but I always thought it was exciting that, like, companies will sometimes kind of like corporations will try to ride a hashtag or a certain trend, and it doesn't work very well. It's inorganic, and what goes viral tends to be kind of human led, whether it's from rage or hate or otherwise. But looking at your stuff, that's not true. So there's a lot of synthetic popularity. I mean, they seem to really have gotten the equation of, like, how to make something viral, and it comes from, as you talked about, the mimetic roots of 4chan, and people very specifically saying, yes, okay, how can we actually affect life online? So can you talk about the role of synthetic popularity? What is that? Journalism, and what is it called? Ideational diffusion. So basically how ideas spread.
Ideas spread. Yeah, it's a posh researcher term for ideas spreading, right, like on any forum, but especially online, of course. Yeah, this is a kind of layer of kind of I suppose it's a different kind of lie that can be told, which is not the content itself, but everything that we then receive that content with an eye to is also part of the story. So, and the most important one is the one you've just put on the table, Karen, which is that it's possible to make things appear kind of much more popular than they really are. And I think this was actually the function of a lot of these automated accounts, was not actually to to spread the material per se, but to kind of emulate the crowd reaction to the material. So to make something appear like it's got this big wellspring of support and kind of all these echoing entirely fake digital cheers that you can surround it with. The virality as a particular force, I think, is also subject to this kind of manipulation. Now, virality, I'm endlessly fascinated with. It was going to be the subject of my first book, in fact. I still think that I should have written that book. But it's virality being this kind of invisible force that kind of determines that some messages become unbelievably powerful, potent, visible things online, and almost everything else actually dies out. And most of the time we're shouting into a digital void that can't even hear us at all. And it looks so organic. But I went to a whole series of different viral advertising studios. It turns out that London's one of the kind of viral advertising, I didn't even know that was an industry, capitals of the world. And, they all exist in order to, very deliberately and reliably make some things go viral and not other things. Viral advertising is entirely predicated on the kind of seeming construction of this apparent organic thing, thing that comes out of nowhere, but it's not. And a lot of it isn't really kind of like, kind of dark magic of any kind. It's just, it's two main forces, really. It's about sculpting the idea to cut away what they call ballast, I learned. So anything that isn't the core of the idea itself, any complexity, anything which can like weigh the idea down by making it more complex, or basically by acting as a barrier between it and it making an extremely powerful emotional reaction in us. That's really what you need the idea to do.
So remove any complication or nuance of an issue.
Yeah.
Marketers or, marketer and propagandists or, logos and slogans. They're experts at this. Yeah.
Exactly. And especially for virals, eliciting a really powerful like emotional arousal. So kind of fear, funny, sexy, cute, like one of those four things really. And then seeding is basically a bit more hidden, I think, to most people. But that's kind of, you understand how networks work and you kind of work out, okay, well, if I put the would-be viral in at that person and that person and that person and that person, then given the kind of network kind of structure, I'm giving it the best possible chance of spreading.
So the use of influencers as well as the use of like knowledge of the algorithms and the systems of like when to post it and where the super spreader information nodes are in the system.
Yeah, and often like quite kind of like not necessarily like huge booming like A-list megastars. I think that's often what people think of when they think of influencers, but quite often like micro influencers, a lot of these studios told me are really important. So it's actually microbrewery. Your viral soft launch of your new microbrewery actually involves you getting 15 of the most kind of popular microbrewer bloggers in the country to all just do something at the same time. And they might only have 10 or 20,000 followers. And it's certainly not kind of Rihanna levels. But that can really ignite a community with kind of, an emotion that you want.
Probably more so than the Rihanna one, I guess, which I'm sure they're aware of, in the sense that once someone gets a certain level of power, then there starts to become a certain level of critique or around their genuineness, right? So it seems more real when it's coming from the micro influencer, and the real influencer, like, oh, they're probably getting paid for it. And it's like, well, I mean, anyways, but it's an interesting, what of this democracy and democratization? Because, we talk about the internet, it's being, it's championed as a platform in terms of access, that it democratized media platforms for so many. They could have a voice. You could speak directly to someone famous. You could be retweeted by the president. But of course, we see that democracy is in a crisis. What are the connections there? And how is our relationship with democracy changing in terms of big conceptual understandings of democracy, as well as like the disrupting of the actual democratic process around the world?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, what a simmering cauldron of different influences and factors there for us to unpack. One of the most important questions we've been trying to deal with for coming on to a decade now has exactly been this question of democracy in tech. Let's begin in 2012, very briefly. When kind of we were all like very naively, and I say we, I mean really I and lots of other writers were cheering as Tahrir Square filled with people that we were convinced were there because of Facebook. And we thought that the democratization of voices would literally make autocracies outmoded. That was the kind of, that was the strength of feeling then. I think what was really happening was something much more subtle than that, and far less kind of morally unambiguous. Social media and the internet had essentially toppled the barriers to entry into mass mobilization and mass communications. And what that meant was that protest became much, much easier. So previously, to mobilize a genuine mass revolution or a mass movement of any kind, you required big hierarchical organizations. I mean, a lot of the kind of testimonies from people involved in the kind of 1960s civil rights movements in the States will tell you like how much actual professional organizing was involved in all of that. That people booked lots of buses to take people to hear Martin Luther King speak. There were rooms full of professional organizers that would do all this kind of thing. And then suddenly with the Arab Spring, we were realizing that what used to be difficult and time consuming and expensive was in fact now much cheaper and easier to do. What we didn't realize was that was going to benefit mobilizations and political mobilizations across the entire political spectrum and across the entire world. So of course there was going to be pro-democracy activists in Egypt, but there was also going to be radical Islamists in Egypt. There was going to be anti-corruption activists in Poland, but then also ultranationalists in Poland. There was going to be the Me Too movement, but there was also going to be a radical manosphere counter-reaction to that. And all of them would kind of each benefit from the same tools. Like there wasn't a political segment that we could lift out and say they are going to be the people that are going to benefit from digital mobilization. And in many ways, from Tahrir Square to what we saw in the Capitol riot just a few days ago, I think is the full circle of that happening. So from there being a pro-democracy revolution to there being a revolution literally invading the beating heart of a democracy, using this basically the same tools of digital mobilization. I mean, and that's that kind of loop closing, and kind of really like the only real group that hasn't benefited from this has been the kind of mainstream, because they were the people that always had access to those expensive and difficult, channels of mass communication and mass organization. If it feels like the mainstream's under attack from everything that isn't itself, it's because it is, literally because of this mobilization that can now happen. So that's what's happening now. And I think like democracy, insofar as it is part of that mainstream, is really shaking, because now it's very, very easy to mobilize and protest against anything that you don't like. I think the future strength of democracy is going to really be based on quite a different question, though, which is not can we use digital tools to mobilize and protest, but can we actually use digital tools to come together in a consensus? That's going to be the kind of big new question, because it will be consensuses that democracies need to make decisions, or any political system needs really to make decisions. And it will be that question which basically will determine whether we move towards a digital form of democracy as well, not just of protest, but of actual democratic decision makings and formal uses of political power within democracies. And I'm pretty optimistic. I went to Taiwan. I did a documentary on the digital democrats of Taiwan for the BBC, and I came back really thinking that there was an amazing example of people that have genuinely found ways of finding consensus using digital tools. It's an amazing undertaking, and now they are, dozens of times they have created now, new regulations and laws on the basis of digital democratic processes. So I think there's a lot that the rest of the world now has to learn from places like Taiwan, not only in the way that they're dealing with the pandemic, but there's much there, especially the use of technology actually, but also now about kind of connecting democratic decision making with exactly the technology. Well, not exactly the technologies, not Twitter and Facebook actually, but actually quite different technologies. But exactly the same kind of like enthusiasm that we have for doing politics online, that at the moment is kind of really undermining democratic institutions themselves.
Interesting. Yes, you talk about some very interesting, like about the representational politics as being kind of a thing of the past, and also the stock having gone down on that for quite some time, in the sense that the electorate has almost been boycotting this inferior product as they kind of see. And I have to say, sometimes when I read techno solutionist stuff and get really excited about, always like I'm a total extremist. I must be a product of my times. I mean, I the only thing I don't have is ambivalence towards, I'm either like extremely excited about the possibilities, or I'm like cowering in a corner being like, we're all gonna die. So, and I love what you present in terms of, and I want to get a little bit more into that when we talk about some of the solutions in terms of blockchain and some of the possibilities of different decentralized power systems. But you talk about, how we've always had these kind of practical concerns of democracy. We need kind of parliamentary representation, and that potentially with these technological things we could have our vote, like literally, I mean, anybody who's been involved in a modicum of community activism and organizing knows that, you know, election day is not the beginning nor end of it. And that there's like so much work that, you know, that you have to keep, that a democracy takes work. And would I love to vote over my coffee in the morning with a like, instead of that whole process, or as you suggest, even give my vote on, you know, housing or whatever to organizations that I respect. And
right, and the thing that's I think most exciting about that is that as soon as you don't see democracy as being a series of like baked in institutions and processes that, I mean, in the UK basically descend back to the 17th century, you know, the lid comes off, and what you just said, that, you know, the giving of votes, you know, that's a liquid democracy, you know, and it's just one of like a whole rainbow of different new constitutional settlements that we might now arrive at. That to me is more than the technology that was being used, or the, you know, kind of platforms that were being deployed or anything like that. That was the most empowering kind of idea that I took from Taiwan's kind of experiments of digital democracy, is the idea that democracy in its very basic form is a living, breathing piece of social technology in many ways, and that you can change it and you can improve it. You know, that is like, especially for democracies kind of as old as the UK, that's such a difficult idea to ever really kind of find any kind of traction with, because, you know, any change to democratic institutions is considered so threatening. To me, I think that honestly, like the kind of like the survival and renewal of democracy, like, is predicated really on that idea at some point really hitting home, and us beginning to experiment with doing democracy in different ways, liquid, direct, you know, online, offline, or, you know, strange new decentralized kind of forms of it as well, whatever we choose. But there's 100 different things we might do now.
Well, yeah, and I don't know what the ballot is like. My mom's American, so I know that the ballot in the States compared to Canada, like Canada, it's very simplified, and it's very representational, you know, and it's very like, you vote for the local person, and that then they get enough seats and blah blah blah. Whereas the States, like, they vote on like some very specific things. Unfortunately, it becomes completely inaccessible. They're like these like books like this, and you're voting on bill this, and then a bunch of information, you know, disinformation campaigns are used so that you're confused about, is voting no on 230 good or bad, you know what I mean? So you get to this like semantic place where you're like, you have no longer an idea of what you're actually putting into those nuances. So I'm sure that there's other issues, but that's for another day. But it's exciting to think absolutely that we could use technology and our own creative and critical thinking in exploring different ways if this isn't working for us, and if nobody's buying into it anymore. It certainly doesn't work if nobody's buying into it, by definition, right? The democracy has to have the people involved. And you know, you talk about like you know, the power shifts, of course. You know, again, we see these platforms as providing the average citizen like empowerment, you know, empowering voices and empowering people's movements. But perhaps that's the new grand illusion. You know, instead of the illusion of choice, it's been replaced with the illusion of power, perhaps. Katerina Sizig, who I spoke to earlier in the series, talks about some of the 3 ways of addressing deepfakes, legislation, regulation. So the law, techno-solutionism, and media literacy. I wanted to talk about each one of those with you, respectively. What kind of regulation practices and policies are you seeing being implemented that are working, or ones that are getting it wrong as well?
I mean, look, the complaint from so much of the kind of digital policy community for years has been there's not enough digital policy and there's not enough law, and we haven't seen kind of democracies kind of assert control over online worlds, which certainly are influencing them in important ways. There just isn't enough control of any of this, you know, all the way from like, you know, electoral legislation around exactly what you can and can't do online, say or not say online, exactly what are the responsibilities of the platforms in all of this, and platform governance. Consumer rights legislation is a decade obsolete. We haven't even spoken about monopolies, but of course that's extremely important too. So there's just so much kind of renewal of the existing regulatory and legislative frameworks that we have that are needed in order to make them speak to the problems that we're currently seeing. And they're not moving quickly enough. That's the kind of underlying kind of basic problem with all of this. I mean, I think without a pandemic, this would have been the year of digital regulation.
Right.
Governments are really shaping up to it. We're seeing lots and lots of processes kind of kicking off to do it. And, you know, every time there's like a US presidential election, it kind of gets renewed enthusiasm for a while at least. So that's complaint number one. But kind of underlying that, I'm not quite sure that I would call it techno-solutionism, but what I do see is kind of a lot of these questions basically being determined by like dueling technologies. You know, whether it's like, say, privacy, or whether it's going to be like what fundamentally controls the services that we use. Is it a network or is it a company? Or what information can a government access? A lot of these are really, you know, the people really at the core of them kind of see both the courts and public opinion, I think, as a bit of a sideshow. Almost every year, DEF CON happens, which is this huge convention of hackers. And it's really there that I think you see a lot of what's really going to determine the outcomes, where there are some people working on privacy tech, some people working on surveillance tech. And really the question is, which of those two dueling kind of like technology trajectories is going to triumph over the other one? Like, you know, when Apple years ago now was in dispute with the US government over whether the government could get data from its phones. It was, if you remember, the San Bernardino attack, horrible terrorist attack in the States, and the attacker had a phone recovered from him, and the FBI couldn't access it. You know, at the same time as the Apple fighting all of that in the courts, what it was really doing was baking in encryption into all its devices, so that not even it could get the information from an Apple phone. So dueling technology is going to determine a lot of this. That's a lot of where power sits, I think, is in small, highly sophisticated, very motivated and well-capitalized developer teams that build the technologies on either side of this equation. And obviously the slight worry is that these are very closed, opaque processes to almost all of us. Like, we don't really have much of an opportunity to kind of influence like what technology is built on our behalf, and therefore what is made possible or impossible by that technology. And that's kind of like one of the more kind of disempowering, I suppose, kind of conclusions I took from my book, and kind of going around thinking about power for so long was basically that I saw a lot of those questions really being determined by these small teams, and outside of public debate, conversations, democratic decision making, it just felt like, you know, the broad mass of voters and kind of just voices of people that want to have something to do with this, like, just feel very shut out from it.
Yeah, and definitely, I think as an educator, with a media literacy focus, like, for me, that seems like the only antidote. But again, I mean, it's kind of impossible to keep up, right? But I mean, in the sense that it's like, okay, so how can we, you know, pull back the curtain? How can we understand how these things are constructed? Now, they're getting better and better. So, I mean, I don't know how you would, you know, there was a study done a little while ago from, I want to say The Guardian, but it could have been Wired, where they actually created like their own, you know, kind of adversarial network of trying to identify. So it was an AI identifying on the synthetic media what was. But I mean, again, there were some mistakes on the eyes here and an ear there, or whatever. But we can't rely on kind of, you know, a Where's Waldo solution to it, because it very quickly it will be, you know, seamless. But I tend to think, you know, yeah, the only way to arm ourselves is to really understand how these things are constructed, but you present some, you know, much more interesting and very well known to media literacy vernacular tools as well, which are to, slow down, triangulate sources. And you talk about the importance of kind of adding some of the friction and barriers back into our relationship with these systems. Yeah.
Probably the main thing that I kind of wanted to do there was to try and like introduce a body of language which wasn't just about kind of a kind of rationalist way in which we like receive information, but also kind of spoke to the kind of emotional kind of substrate, because so much of the kind of the way in which manipulation happens and the thinking that influence operators have really is about the emotional effects. And whether you're a viral advertiser or you're working for Russia, I think that that's really kind of the majority of your tradecraft is really around changing the way that people feel, really, rather than what they think. I remember very, very vividly a person who I was interviewing who did this kind of thing said to me, "Carl, we don't try and change people's minds by giving them facts which which are lies." He says, "We try and make people angrier about things that they already believe in." That's how manipulation happens. And then we try and steer that outrage in certain ways. And that makes a lot of sense. And it explains why, for instance, when we dissect a Iranian or Chinese or Russian influence network online, we see that they're sitting on both sides of the political spectrum. They both try and infiltrate Black Lives Matter, and they try and infiltrate the alt-right, and then they feed both of them more and more information, making them angry about what the other side is doing. So kind of in response to that, kind of the kind of like, provisos I was trying to put in were things like kind of guard against outrage, know that this is the easiest way of manipulating you online. Know that it's when you're nodding your head in agreement of something, that is when you are also most vulnerable. That is going to be when your behavior is being molded. It's not when your mind is being changed as a result of this new amazing fact that you're not kind of equipped to know is false has suddenly fallen into your timeline. That's not how human beings work.
Yeah, know thyself and what some of the things are, and that's such a difficult process. I mean, that's such a long process. I feel like I saw something the other day that was Save the Children on Instagram came up, and it was like a bunch of like young brown and black women who supposedly from this like screenshot had been saved from a sex whatever ring or whatever, and it immediately I immediately wanted to be like, save children,
who doesn't want to save the children?
Young women of color are most vulnerable. And it was that nodding moment. Luckily I had enough skills. I mean, I think about this and teach this like for 15 years, so it's a little, that's a lot. Like, people can't dedicate their lives to media literacy to be able to navigate the day-to-day social environment. But luckily, it was exactly because it got me right in the right place and I was like, you suspect, and went and looked up and immediately found that of course it was it's completely is there a way for us to embed the right behaviors and values in young people in the beginnings, in the inceptions of new technologies, the beginning of the algorithm before it's at the point of exponentials or whatever, and we go, hey, we don't like the attitudes, it's proliferating. Like, is there or is it always co-opted and corrupted by nefarious forces who just want to watch the world burn, or who benefit because people will say, well, why would you think that this thing is a conspiracy theorist, or these people are obviously that they have no institutional power, like how are they working together? And I'm like, no, they're just grifters. They just benefit from you making a rational decision. Like, so many people benefit from that, but I can see how people could think, no, like governments are conspiring, you know what I mean? Like, that's where the power is. How can you say that the unemployed, angry racist, like in the next town over, somehow has a comparable power, but for somehow they are, massively affecting just our relationship with all things, like with truth in general. are there ways that we can guard these very persuasive tools and make sure to put them to arm and level up the skill levels of those most vulnerable to these media manipulations by the bad people?
It's a great question, and I actually ultimately don't think it could be left up to each of us as individuals just to kind of guard ourselves, because I mean, look, the problem is we don't want to guard ourselves. It's like someone shouting free beer and everyone's like, well, I like free beer. Like we want to get outraged about things that we find outrageous, like, and we want to get angry about things we find deeply unjust. It's unbelievably difficult to begin to kind of like, confront those like fundamental human drivers. I think ultimately it's going to be a bit of a mixture, isn't it? Like, partly we have to bake these kinds of things into education, both formal and informal, that we do. I frankly think, Karen, that the work of you and people like you should be funded by the defence budget and kind of scaled up enormously. I honestly think that this is a question of national security, and the resources of the state for national security should be deployed in things like this. We need far more librarians and digital literacy educators and philosophers now to kind of, increase the resilience of our own populations. But then partly this is going to sit with the platforms. And one of the problems here is that it is the platforms have been built exactly to, and I don't use this word lightly, exploit the cognitive biases that we have, that we've just been talking about, in order to keep you on the platform. Like, they're engaged in this war for eyeballs, and a lot of what they have done is design themselves to serve up information which they think will keep you there, which turns out often to be information which causes the emotional arousals that we've been talking about, and that, is the window through which manipulation often happens. A lot of what they're going to have to do is tweak the underlying platform mechanics in different ways, probably to step away from this kind of attentional conflict that they're in, this attentional race, and slow down information, make it travel less virally across the internet, give us pause before we share things, force us to pause. Lots of little things like that they can probably do, and I think they probably will do in the years ahead. I think, if nothing else, pandemic and the election we've just seen in the States have been pretty gruesome wake-up calls to the online platforms that they were not set up to deal with this properly.
There's definitely a raise in awareness. Hopefully the funding is to follow from your lips to the funders' ears, because it's definitely some important qualities. Is that critical thinking, the slowing down. I think that's a really big one. And you talked about how much easier it is to upload something than it is to take it down, and just how much we need to add some slowness to the, the complaint is always that these systems, the school system in particular, is incredibly archaic and slow to move, and maybe we should just abandon it, as some of the technology arguments, pro-technology arguments, but it's got all the ethics and values that we want to bake into the things that we're making, which are slow, thoughtfulness, even group rules like agreements. I don't know how it is in the UK, but here you can't do a workshop even at a corporation, let alone a school classroom, without talking about group agreements, posting it, talking about safe space and these kinds of things that seem to just, and then the rest of our life online, it's not there. That conversation is not happening there. What is the role of the arts and the artist in all of this? Because that's really what I explore with young people, or arts and culture.
To reimagine all of this for us. Like, we can talk about tech and data till the cows come home, but we also just need imaginations to soar into new spaces, to reconceive of what it means to be human, which both, doesn't accept the current state of things, but also isn't clawing back into the past. We need a kind of brave reimagining of humanity, really. And I think that probably art, more than any other discipline, can begin to do that for us.
In media literacy education, I mean, you talked about how important it is. Where do we start? Is there a discipline? Is there an entry point? Is there a subject matter? I mean, you seem to think like security, like just national security, which I think is an interesting part of the discussion that other folks didn't flag, from your perspective, in terms of like, it's an actual immediate safety issue. Like, we actually need to be armed with these critical thinking skills, etc. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it kind of informational defense. I mean, like, I think it's the only informational defense that we can currently think of, which seems to be kind of individually empowering and not kind of fundamentally, shredding the kind of balances that we have around the state and a free press and the military and the information that we see. So, I mean, for me, I'd begin that at the risk of militarizing your profession, Karen, and I don't want to do that, but I would certainly begin to look at these kinds of things, as one of the, almost like the vaccination for all of these kinds of pursuits. But then, I think literacy itself also, just as a final concluding thought, kind of also really does need to kind of not simply have a kind of rational actor paradigm of information and literacy and reception and reaction. I do think that there's a lot here to do with identity and belonging, and emotion and feeling and kinship and family, and that's a lot of the story here when we talk about online manipulation. And I think kind of there surely therefore has to kind of be almost like a new literacy, which kind of begins to gather up those other parts of us, of humanity, really, and thread that in as part of the story of why we believe certain things and why we react to certain information the way that we do.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Carl. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thanks. I really enjoyed that. Yeah. What a great conversation. Thank you very much, Karen.
And thanks to those who listened to this episode. For more on the topic of synthetic media, listen to the podcast extra for this episode, where Carl and I discuss blockchain technology as a means for combating deepfakes. Until then, stay creative and do be artists. When I talk about techno solutionism, I think of like, how can we make metadata transparent? Watermarks has always been an interesting solution, but we have the tech to fix watermarks and remove watermarks, and people don't care about watermarks and whatever, right? And that's more of a licensing, like financial, how do you own the property kind of thing. AI detecting other AI, and then the AI gets smarter and the other AI gets smarter and whatever. Blockchain, which is essentially is like a shared ledger in real time, or like I say to writers, if you've ever sent a script to yourself in a sealed envelope, right? That's the old school copyright way, right? You send it to yourself in a sealed registered mail and you don't open it. It's kind of like doing that times a million, right? So on every single server, there's kind of a timestamp of like, this thing happened at this time, and then, it was manipulated again. And I don't know what the privacy issues or the licensing issues in terms of like owning content when it's copied on millions and millions of servers at a time. But can blockchain, because I know you talk about the decentralization of power, and of course that's so connected to what blockchain presents in terms of like system thinking. Could blockchain potentially could this be the problem that blockchain could solve?
Yeah, possibly. So I think it's definitely true to say that like kind of the centralized model of Silicon Valley, with big companies at the heart of massive platforms, certainly sees complete decentralized networks as a threat to that, like the most fundamental threat, actually. And there's already social media platforms that are based on decentralized models, and there's you can imagine all kinds of services happening with no kind of company at the heart of them. The DAO, the Digital Autonomous Organization, was a company itself, where the rules for it were baked onto an Ethereum smart contract on the blockchain, not an articles of incorporation. So yes, it really possibly could. On the other hand, even these networks create new. I'm a big fan of like exposing hidden centers of power. I think this is basically what I've done for almost 10 years now. And if you look at decentralized networks, they clearly have other centers of power. Like Bitcoin has no governance around. There's a power around the actual protocol, like push power, I would call it, which is who can actually change the Bitcoin protocol itself. There's no governance around how that can happen. There's just some people with basically the power to commit changes. It's very, very weird, but there you go. Secondly, there's enormous concentrations of not only ownership of Bitcoin, but also the mining power to mine Bitcoin. And you get, there have been conferences where you've got a kind of a significant tranche of the world's mining power all in one room talking about Bitcoin mining. So this thing hasn't thrown power to the edges of the network in that way either. And then lastly, just like, I think the kind of power of actually understanding what on earth this technology is. I mean, I remember spending, months reading Satoshi Nakamoto's initial paper on Bitcoin and all the documentation then kind of that blew up around it. And it's still like unbelievably mysterious to me, like how actually cryptocurrencies really work and what the blockchain really is. I think a lot of people have dumped a huge amount of money into things like that without ever really asking how they work. And I think that is a foolhardy thing to do. So, and of course, a lot of this isn't governed by any kind of legal protection. So the law normally prevents the strong victimizing the weak, but there's no market protections in Bitcoin because it's not necessarily considered an asset. So you've got all kinds of market manipulation happening there.
Right.